10 years ago, the world faced an unprecedented catastrophe when a massive swarm of extraterrestrial life forms, known as EVA, descended upon Earth. These monstrous beings invaded the planet in overwhelming numbers, wiping out entire cities in an instant. Human weapons, no matter how advanced, proved utterly ineffective against them. For a brief moment, it seemed as if humanity was on the verge of extinction, unable to mount any significant resistance. However, in an ironic twist of fate, the very presence of the EVA introduced a cosmic substance known as element into Earth's atmosphere. This mysterious energy triggered a transformation in the human population, granting them incredible abilities. This sudden evolution led to the beginning of humanity's counterattack against the EVA, shifting the balance of power and igniting a new age of warfare where gifted individuals became Earth's last hope. Fast forward to the present day, the world has drastically changed. In order to combat the EVA, humanity established elite training academies to cultivate powerful warriors. One such institution, the 8th Special Forces Training School, commonly known as Hachi School, is regarded as the nation's top facility, gathering talented students aged 15 and older with exceptional alpha abilities. These young fighters are trained to become humanity's strongest defenders, ready to take on the extraterrestrial threat. In front of the grand tower of the school stands the protagonist of our story, gazing up at the prestigious institution. His expression holds a mix of determination and resignation as he reflects on his situation. Though he technically belongs to this place, his role is far from glamorous. Just as he muses about his presence at the academy, an empty can strikes his head. The impact startles him, and he looks up to see a sneering student standing a few feet away. It turns out to be one of the school's bullies, a privileged student with alpha abilities. The bully smirks and orders him to dispose of the trash, mocking his lack of powers. The protagonist clenches his fists, but ultimately bends down to pick up the can. In this world, individuals are ranked according to the strength of their alpha abilities. The ranking system categorizes them into different levels, with E and F designated for civilian reserves, while A to D ranks are for specialized soldiers. At the top of this hierarchy are the S-rank individuals, legendary warriors whose power is unparalleled. However, amidst all of this, the protagonist is an anomaly. He is the only known human who did not awaken to any alpha ability, rendering him unranked. As he picks up the discarded can, he mutters under his breath, refusing to acknowledge the idea that rank determines a person's worth. His defiance irritates the bully, who wastes no time in launching an attack. With a sadistic grin, he beats the protagonist mercilessly, knocking him to the ground. Grabbing him by the hair, the bully sneers, asserting his dominance as a ranked individual. Channeling his ability, he conjures a fireball in his hand, threatening to educate the unranked janitor on the true meaning of power. However, just as he prepares to unleash his flames, something unexpected happens. The fireball in his palm suddenly crystallizes, turning into ice. Shocked, he stares at his frozen hand, unable to comprehend what just occurred. A commanding voice interrupts the scene, questioning why an alpha ability meant for fighting EVA is being used against a powerless civilian. The bully turns to see the source of the voice, Hyuga Orin, a first-year student at Hachi School and one of the most promising S-rank warriors. She is known as the Ice Wall Witch, and her mere presence is enough to make the bully back off. Though irritated, he clicks his tongue and mutters under his breath before leaving. Hyuga then turns her attention to the protagonist, still lying on the ground. As she picks up the can, she coldly advises him not to defy those of higher rank, reminding him that in times of emergency, higher-ranked individuals are even granted permission to eliminate lower-ranked ones. Her words are laced with superiority, reflecting the deep-seated belief that rank dictates a person's worth. However, the protagonist simply smiles and thanks her for picking up the can. He boldly declares that rank and alpha abilities are meaningless. What truly matters is a person's actions. His job as a janitor is to support the students of Hachi School, ensuring they can train to protect humanity. His unwavering resolve leaves Hyuga momentarily speechless. Watching him walk away with a casual wave, she furrows her brows, murmuring to herself about how strange he is. As he disappears from sight, a memory from the past flashes in his mind. 8 years ago, a younger version of himself sat crying, his tears rolling down his cheeks as he confided in his mother. He had always been ridiculed for not having an alpha ability, constantly made fun of by his peers. But his mother's gentle voice reassured him, reminding him that a person's worth was not determined by what they possessed, but by what they did. She told him that he didn't need an alpha ability to be valuable. He simply needed to find a way to be useful to others in his own way. With renewed determination, the young boy had wiped his tears and promised his mother that he would try his best. However, life had other plans. Eventually, his mother fell gravely ill. The doctors explained that her body was unable to withstand the strain of her own alpha ability, and unfortunately, there was no treatment available. As she lay in the hospital, whispers of judgment surrounded them. A nurse scoffed at the situation, muttering how pitiful it was that both the mother and child were unranked. Two worthless individuals unable to contribute to society in any meaningful way. The words stung, embedding themselves deep in the young boy's heart. Standing outside the academy, the present-day protagonist clenches his fists. The memory of her words echoes in his mind, strengthening his resolve. Despite lacking any alpha abilities, he remains firm in his belief that he can contribute in his own way. The scene shifts to the present, where he diligently carries out his work as a janitor at Hachi School, the country's top training institution for young warriors with exceptional alpha abilities. With a cloth in hand, he wipes the floors, polishes the windows, and scrubs the toilets with unwavering dedication. Finishing his work earlier than expected, he considers heading outside to continue his duties. Meanwhile, in the training grounds, an instructor announces the beginning of a practical exercise for the students. The trainees, all ranked B or higher, are assigned one C-class EVA each, a test meant to gauge their combat skills. As the instructor gives the signal, the cages are opened, and monstrous four-legged creatures emerge, launching an immediate attack. Among the trainees, two figures stand out, the arrogant bully and the elite ice-wielding girl. Without hesitation, they unleash their abilities. The bully conjures a massive fire-based attack, while the girl erects an unbreakable ice wall, effectively eliminating the EVAs in an instant. Their overwhelming power astonishes the other students, who marvel at their prowess. They boast that, at this rate, even an S-class opponent would be no challenge. Uninterested in the display of power, the protagonist focuses on his task, picking up a discarded can. However, just as he is about to leave, a blinding light suddenly streaks across the sky. The city trembles as the beam strikes, creating a powerful shockwave. In an instant, buildings crumble, roads split apart, and chaos erupts. Alarm sirens blare, signaling an emergency. A warning echoes across the school's communication system. An EVA attack has been detected in District D48, right near Hachi School. The students barely have time to react when a monstrous entity emerges. Unlike the previously encountered EVAs, this one is on an entirely different level. A massive dragon with a black-scaled body and glowing blue patterns looms over the battlefield, exuding an aura of sheer dominance. The city's defense system issues an emergency directive, calling for all C-rank and higher warriors to engage the beast immediately. The protagonist, caught in the chaos, is overwhelmed by the sheer size of the creature. He watches as the high-ranking trainees confidently step forward, convinced that their elite status makes them unstoppable. The bully, full of arrogance, rallies his peers, claiming that the dragon was foolish to appear in a place full of top warriors. Without proper formation or strategy, the overconfident trainees charge toward the dragon, eager to defeat it and earn recognition. Disregarding the warnings of the ice-wielding girl, the group recklessly launches their strongest attacks. Now, the air crashing into the beast in a powerful explosion. The battlefield is engulfed in smoke and debris. The trainees, assuming victory, cheer triumphantly, believing that they have slain the dragon with their overwhelming firepower. However, as the dust settles, their celebration turns to horror. From within the smoke, the dragon's head emerges, completely unscathed. Its eyes glow with an eerie light, radiating pure malice. A deafening roar shakes the entire area, sending waves of fear through the ranks. The trainees, once so confident, now find themselves paralyzed in disbelief. How could their combined attacks have done nothing? With a menacing glare, the dragon retaliates. From its massive jaws, a surge of energy builds, and in the next instant, a devastating breath attack is unleashed. A beam of destructive energy, reminiscent of a godlike force, sweeps across the battlefield, annihilating everything in its path. Realizing the impending doom, the ice-wielding girl springs into action. She erects an enormous ice barrier, shielding herself and the remaining warriors from the dragon's wrath. The barrier absorbs the brunt of the attack, but the sheer force causes cracks to form. The trainees huddle behind her, their bravado now completely shattered. They are no longer warriors, just terrified children in the face of an unstoppable force. The protagonist watches as the shield finally shatters, sending the ice-wielding girl flying backward. The elite trainees, who had been so sure of their victory moments ago, are now scattered, injured, and in disarray. It dawns on him that the strongest students, those meant to be humanity's last line of defense, have been utterly crushed in an instant. Panic spreads among the rankers as they come to a terrifying realization. The dragon before them is no ordinary Eva. It is the same monstrous being that devastated Tokyo 8 years ago. It is the strongest species, the calamity that left an entire city in ruins. Terror grips the warriors as the dragon prepares its next attack. Their confidence shatters completely, replaced by sheer survival instinct. Amidst the destruction, the protagonist stands frozen, watching as the supposed protectors of humanity crumble before his eyes. The air was thick with the scent of destruction as the massive dragon advanced toward the fleeing rankers. Its glowing blue patterns pulsed with energy, casting an eerie light over the battlefield. The top-ranked warriors, who had once boasted of their strength, now scrambled in terror, their confidence shattered. The sheer presence of the beast crushed any remnants of arrogance they had left. Among them, the Ice Princess desperately tried to rally her peers. She shouted, urging them to stand their ground and fight. If they, the strongest, ran away, who would protect the civilians? But her words fell on deaf ears. Fear had already taken hold of their hearts. One of the fleeing rankers, his voice trembling, cried out for help, his pleas echoing through the chaos. But before anyone could react, the dragon's massive jaw snapped shut around him. His scream was cut short as his body was torn in half, his remains swallowed whole. The horrific sight sent a new wave of terror through the rankers. The Ice Princess, frozen in place, felt her blood run cold. This wasn't just a mindless monster, it was a predator. It hunted not just to destroy, but to devour. She had read about Evas that fed on humans, but witnessing it firsthand was something else entirely. Before she could process her fear, the dragon's piercing gaze landed on her. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from its chest as it prepared to strike. Without warning, a long, grotesque, parasite-like appendage shot from the dragon's mouth, slithering through the air with terrifying speed. Panic set in. Her body screamed for her to move, but she was paralyzed, unable to react in time. Then, just as the creature was about to reach her, something unexpected happened. A figure dashed through the battlefield, moving faster than anyone could anticipate. The protagonist, gripping a large sack filled with dry leaves, leaped forward and flung its contents directly at the dragon's face. The sudden impact and cloud of debris caused the dragon to recoil for a moment, confused and agitated. Seizing the opportunity, he grabbed the Ice Princess, lifting her onto his back without hesitation. With every ounce of strength he had, he ran. His mind raced as he searched for a safe escape route. His eyes landed on a manhole cover near the edge of the battlefield. Reaching the manhole, he pried open the heavy metal cover and gestured toward the darkness below. He assured her that the sewers were a safer option. He had cleaned them before and knew their layout well. Without waiting for a response, he lowered her down first before following himself. The cover slammed shut above them, just as the dragon's parasite appendage struck where they had been standing moments ago. The underground tunnel was damp and smelled of stagnant water, but for now, it was their only refuge. As he carried her through the maze-like sewer system, the princess found herself lost in thought. Why would a mere janitor risk everything to save someone like her? He spoke with a steady voice, explaining that he had simply done what he could. One didn't need an alpha ability to help others. Her heart skipped a beat. His words were simple, yet profound. For years, she had been surrounded by people who judged worth by rank and strength. But here was someone who believed otherwise, who had risked everything despite having nothing to gain. A faint blush spread across her cheeks as she muttered her gratitude. He had saved her life, and for that, she owed him. Following the sewer's winding path, they finally emerged near the entrance of an underground shelter. A reinforced steel door stood before them, a beacon of safety in the chaos above. With relief in his voice, the protagonist pointed toward it. They had made it. But just as they approached, the heavy doors began to slide shut. Panic surged through him as he shouted for them to wait. He carried the princess in his arms, desperate to get her to safety. From inside, voices shouted back. The shelter was already at full capacity. The surrounding residents had rushed in, and there was simply no room for more. They were told to find another place. For a moment, despair threatened to take hold, but then a murmur ran through the crowd. Someone inside recognized the princess. Whispers spread like wildfire. She was Hyuga, the elite S-rank student. Almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. A voice called out to make room for her no matter what. The protagonist breathed a sigh of relief, thinking they had been saved. But as he stepped forward, still carrying her, a firm hand shoved him backward. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance, as another student sneered down at him. Recognition flashed in the boy's eyes as he pointed accusingly. He had seen him before. He was the unranked janitor from their school. Disgust dripped from his words as he declared that someone like him didn't belong in the shelter. There was no place for the weak, no space for someone who couldn't contribute. The protagonist was stunned. He had risked everything to get here, yet he was being turned away solely because of his lack of rank. The Ice Princess, still in his arms, immediately protested. She demanded that they let him in, explaining that he had saved her life. But the voices inside remained firm. There was no room for someone like him. Frustration filled her as she turned to him, her expression filled with guilt. If they truly had no space, then she would leave instead. He was the one who had saved her. He deserved safety more than anyone else. But before she could act, the ground trembled. A deep, earth-shaking rumble signaled the approach of something massive. The walls of the underground shelter vibrated, and dust fell from the ceiling. The crowd inside screamed. The strongest species was near. Fear overtook them, and without another word, they began closing the shelter doors. The princess gasped, realizing what was happening, but before she could react, she felt herself being pushed forward. The protagonist, with one final effort, shoved her inside just as the heavy steel doors slammed shut behind her. He remained on the outside. Silence stretched for a moment as he turned back toward the destruction above. The truth was now undeniable. Rank and abilities didn't define a person's worth. It wasn't about titles or power. It was about action. As the heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing the shelter from the outside world, the protagonist was left standing alone in the cold, desolate ruins. He took a deep breath, his heartbeat steady, despite the terrifying reality before him. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the air, sending shivers down his spine. Slowly, he turned around, only to find himself face to face with the monstrous dragon once more. Its massive body loomed over him, casting a shadow that stretched across the shattered ground. Its thick obsidian scales glistened under the dim light, while its enormous wings spread wide, ready to strike. Two piercing eyes locked onto him with an intelligence that sent a shudder of dread through his soul. Sharp, curved horns protruded from its skull, and its gaping maw, lined with razor-like fangs, dripped with the remains of its last victim. Yet, despite the overwhelming presence of death before him, the protagonist did not flinch. He stood his ground, gripping a rusted iron rod that he had picked up earlier. With a determined glare, he lunged forward, swinging the iron rod with all his might. The impact barely scratched the dragon's thick scales, but he did not stop. Blow after blow he struck, each attack carrying the weight of his conviction. Then, in an instant, everything ended. The dragon moved faster than he could react. Its jaws snapped shut around his body, slicing through flesh and bone effortlessly. Pain surged through him, but it was fleeting. His vision blurred as he felt himself being torn apart, his very existence being reduced to nothing. His body crumbled, scattered into pieces like dust in the wind. As the last remnants of his consciousness began to fade, regret clawed at his mind. His entire life, he had believed that actions determined a person's worth, that no matter how weak or powerless he was, he could still prove himself through effort. But now, as he faced the inevitable truth of his mortality, he realized something bitter. He had always wanted an alpha ability. No matter how much he tried to deny it, deep down, he had wished for power. Not for himself, but to stand up against those who had looked down on his mother. But just as the last flicker of his existence was about to disappear, something unexpected happened. A bright, ethereal screen appeared before his fading consciousness. Alpha Ability Activation Condition. Death has been met. A surge of energy unlike anything he had ever felt before coursed through what remained of him. His mind, which had been slipping into nothingness, was forcefully pulled back. A deep, resonating voice, neither human nor machine, spoke once more. Activating ability, Apex Predator, Black Hole. Suddenly, the sky trembled. A massive, swirling vortex materialized above the battlefield. Its edges shimmered with a gravitational force so intense that reality seemed to bend around it. The black hole, dark and infinite, pulsed with power. The dragon, sensing danger for the first time, roared in confusion. Its massive body twitched involuntarily as an invisible force began pulling at it. The monstrous beast that had devoured countless victims now found itself ensnared by something far greater. The system notification echoed again. Beginning target consumption. The black hole's pull intensified. The dragon's enormous frame convulsed as its flesh, scales, and even the very essence of its being were stripped away piece by piece. The consumption process began at a terrifying pace. Consumption rate, 20%. The once mighty beast thrashed in agony, trying desperately to resist, but it was futile. The vortex swallowed it whole, leaving behind nothing but emptiness. Consumption rate, 90%, 100%, and then silence. The vortex, having completed its purpose, began to contract, shrinking into itself until it condensed into a solid form, a crystal, black as the void yet shimmering with raw, pulsating energy. The air crackled with an unknown force as the crystal trembled, as if something inside was fighting to emerge. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the crystal cracked. A gust of wind exploded outward as fragments shattered, scattering like broken glass. The dust settled, revealing a figure standing amidst the remnants of the destruction. A faint blue aura radiated from his body, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with newfound vitality. His senses were sharper, his body felt stronger, more powerful than ever before. His mind reeled as he tried to process what had happened. He had been devoured by the strongest species, by an entity that no human could hope to defeat. Yet now, he was alive. And more importantly, he was starving. Before he could fully grasp the situation, the ethereal system screen flickered before his eyes once more. Successfully consumed the strongest species, Ava. A new prompt appeared. You can now use the strongest species' unique alpha ability. Would you like to activate it? Yes or no? As he stared at the glowing words, realization finally sank in. He had not just survived, he had evolved. After saying he was hungry, the protagonist suddenly felt his body grow weak. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the ground. A strange sensation took over him, as if his strength was being drained away. Just then, something unexpected happened. A small black hole appeared in the palm of his hand. It wasn't as massive as the one before, but it had the same mysterious pull. Before he could understand what was going on, the giant crystal that had formed earlier began to shake. Slowly, it started moving toward the black hole in his hand. Within moments, the entire crystal was sucked in, leaving him lying on the ground, alone and exhausted. Suddenly, he heard a voice. At first, it was faint, like a whisper in the wind, but soon it grew louder. The words became clear. It was demanding something back. The voice was filled with anger, frustration, and desperation. It echoed in his mind, making his head throb. He didn't recognize it, but somehow it felt familiar. Then he opened his eyes. Before him stood the dragon. It was just as massive and terrifying as before, with sharp fangs and piercing eyes filled with rage. The beast glared at him, its voice booming as it demanded the return of its body. Its presence was overwhelming, shaking the very air around them. Before the protagonist could react, the dragon lunged toward him, its mouth wide open, ready to swallow him whole. The moment felt endless as he braced himself for the attack. But then, he woke up. His body jerked upright as he gasped for air. He looked around, confused and disoriented. The cold, sterile walls and the steady beeping of machines told him he was in a hospital. The nightmare had felt so real. But now he was here, alive. His mind raced. How was he still breathing? He had been eaten, torn apart completely. There was no way he should be alive. Was it all a dream? As he struggled to process everything, his eyes landed on his palm. A strange, dark mark was there. It wasn't a wound, nor was it a scar. It was something else, something unnatural. As he stared at it, a strange feeling spread through him. Then, something happened. Before he could react, something emerged from it. A tiny creature floated before him. It had small horns, delicate wings, and a faint glow around its body. Despite its size, it carried an air of arrogance. The creature stared at him with sharp eyes and, in a high-pitched voice, demanded something unexpected. It wanted its body back. The protagonist was taken aback. He had no idea what this thing was or where it had come from. Was it the dragon? The strongest species that had once stood before him? He couldn't believe it. This tiny, almost ridiculous-looking creature was claiming to be the same terrifying beast. The small being, clearly offended by his doubt, puffed up and declared itself as the ruler of all extraterrestrial life. It insisted that it was still the strongest species. The protagonist stared at it, unconvinced. Where was the terrifying aura, the overwhelming power? This thing didn't seem dangerous at all. Seeing his disbelief, the tiny dragon became frustrated. It pointed to the patterns on its horns, insisting they were proof of its identity. The protagonist examined them closely, and to his surprise, they did resemble the markings of the dragon he had fought. But even so, he found it hard to accept. The creature, determined to prove itself, confidently declared that it would reveal its true name, a name known only to a select few in the universe. It stood tall, as if preparing for a grand moment. Then, silence. Its expression changed as confusion set in. It couldn't remember its own name. The protagonist lost his patience. Frustration boiling over, he threw a punch at the tiny creature, sending it tumbling through the air. But he wasn't done. Grabbing it, he squeezed it tightly, shaking it furiously. How could it call itself the strongest species when it had caused so much destruction? Did it not realize how many people had died because of it? His classmates, his friends, so many had been killed. And now this small, ridiculous creature was acting as if nothing had happened? Anger surged through him as he tightened his grip. He demanded answers. He wanted justice. The tiny dragon, struggling to speak as it was being squeezed, let out a muffled protest. In a strained voice, it told him the truth. He had already devoured it. The boy froze. The dragon explained that when it had eaten him, something had gone wrong. Instead of completely consuming him, its own body had been pulled inward. The roles had reversed. The predator had become the prey. And now, the boy's body was made from the dragon's very essence. The protagonist's mind reeled at the revelation. The tiny dragon, still stuck in his grip, continued to grumble. It explained that it had been the one to consume him, but instead of digesting him, its own form had been taken in, and now this was all that was left of it. The boy loosened his hold, staring at the tiny creature in disbelief. This being, once feared as the ultimate predator, was now nothing more than a small, powerless remnant of what it used to be. And somehow, his own existence had become tied to it. The protagonist, still trying to process everything, suddenly sensed someone approaching. Panic surged through him as he quickly turned to the small dragon, urging it to hide before they were seen. Before he could think of a proper hiding spot for the tiny creature, the door swung open. A familiar figure entered the room. The Ice Princess, a high-ranking warrior. Her sharp eyes widened in shock when she saw him sitting up in bed. Relief washed over her face as she rushed to his side, exclaiming his name with a mix of disbelief and happiness. She had been told he was unconscious, but now, after an entire week, he was finally awake. Seeing him alive was a miracle. The protagonist, still feeling weak, looked at her and recognized her as someone from Hachi school. She introduced herself properly as Hyuga Orin, and with a casual smile, he decided to call her simply Orin. His relaxed attitude toward addressing someone of her rank caught her off guard, and she frowned slightly at his informal behavior. However, there were more serious matters to discuss. Her expression quickly hardened as she reminded him that he had ignored her orders during the previous battle. As a high ranker, it was her duty to protect civilians, and he had gone against direct instructions. She made it clear that such disobedience wouldn't be tolerated again. The protagonist, feeling a bit guilty, simply stated that he had only done what he could in that moment. He hadn't intentionally ignored orders. He had just acted on instinct. But before they could continue the discussion, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The air around them grew icy, sending a shiver down his spine. It didn't take him long to realize the source of the cold. It was coming from Orin herself. She had activated her power, her face now serious as she prepared to question him. She demanded answers about what had happened on that day a week ago. The strongest species had vanished without a trace, and he was the only known survivor. How had he managed to live through something that should have been impossible? Answering this question, she told him, was his responsibility to humanity. The protagonist, still trying to grasp the fact that a whole week had passed, was shocked. Had he really been unconscious for that long? Orion confirmed it, explaining that he had been in a coma at the 8th Special Forces Hospital ever since that fateful day. To help him understand the situation, she picked up the TV remote and turned on the screen. News reports flashed across the display, showing the state of the world after the strongest species' sudden disappearance. The entire event was still a mystery, and investigators were struggling to make sense of what had happened. According to the reports, all radio signals and surveillance equipment had been disrupted during the attack, making it impossible to capture any footage of the battle. No one had any solid evidence of what had occurred. However, there was one key detail that stood out. At the exact point where the strongest species had vanished, a lone boy had been spotted. The protagonist's heart pounded as he listened to the news. Could it be that the mysterious boy they were talking about was him? Oreen looked at him with piercing eyes and confirmed his suspicions. She was here to find out what truly happened outside the shelter that day. The strongest species had been an unimaginable threat, capable of wiping out humanity. If there was even the slightest chance that it still existed, they needed to locate and neutralize it immediately. As an S-ranker of the 8th Special Forces, it was Orion's duty to investigate, and depending on his answers, she would have to take necessary action. The protagonist felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. She wanted the truth, but the truth was something even he wasn't sure he fully understood. He hesitated, trying to piece together his fragmented memories. Before he could form a response, a voice suddenly rang inside his head. The small dragon. It mocked him for even considering telling the truth so easily. With an irritated tone, it reminded him that admitting what had happened could put his life in danger. If the humans found out that he had absorbed the strongest species and that his body was now made from it, they would surely see him as a threat. There was no way they would just let him walk free. The voice grew louder, echoing in his mind, causing him to clutch his head in pain. Oren immediately noticed his distress and asked if he was okay. He quickly brushed it off, saying it was just a headache. Meanwhile, the tiny dragon smirked, feeling satisfied that the protagonist was finally realizing the gravity of the situation. It warned him again. Telling the truth would mean his death. Even though the small dragon insisted that lying was the only way to protect himself, he couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. Still gripping the tiny dragon like a plush toy, he made up his mind. Looking straight at Oreen, he decided to tell her everything. He confessed that he had devoured the strongest species using his alpha ability, and as proof, he showed her the strange mark in his palm. The small dragon panicked, realizing what he had just done. It called him a fool, warning that he had just put himself in danger. Oreen, who had been listening carefully, stared at him in shock. Processing his words, her expression changed. What would happen now? Would she see him as an enemy? Or would she believe his story? The fate of the protagonist now hung in the balance. The tension in the room thickened as Oreen narrowed her eyes in confusion. She stared at the protagonist, trying to make sense of his words. He had confidently declared proof of his ability, yet when she looked, she saw nothing. There were no visible black marks, no signs of the strongest species' presence, just an ordinary boy standing before her. If he wasn't going to take this seriously, then she would make him. A glistening ice crystal formed in the palm of her hand, cold air swirling around them as her power flared up. She reminded him that this was a matter of life and death, and if necessary, she would carry out her duty without hesitation. Before he could respond, a sudden shift in the atmosphere sent a jolt of unease through him. The tiny dragon beside him tensed, its golden eyes flashing with recognition. Something was coming. A dark shadow moved across the rooftop, its presence sending a chilling wave of dread through the air. Without wasting a second, the dragon spoke urgently to the protagonist, its voice laced with an intensity he had never heard before. It ordered him to run. The protagonist, startled by the sudden shift in tone, hesitated. What was happening? Why was the dragon suddenly so desperate? Before he could react, the ceiling above them shattered. Debris rained down as a monstrous figure descended into the room. Oreen's breath hitched as she took in the creature before her. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Its black and purple form pulsed with an unnatural energy. This wasn't just any enemy. This was something otherworldly. Oreen wasted no time. Her instincts kicked in, and with a swift motion, she summoned a massive barrier of ice. Her absolute ice wall materialized in front of them, its thick frozen surface shimmering under the hospital lights. This was her strongest defensive technique, one capable of withstanding even the most powerful of S-rank attacks. Yet, she wasn't taking any chances. She identified the creature instantly. This was no ordinary enemy, it was an extraterrestrial life form, an Eva. The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard of Evas before, but why was one here? Why had it come after him? The small dragon, still perched on his shoulder, shouted with alarm. It didn't have time to explain, but one thing was certain. This was beyond anything the protagonist had faced before. This creature was stronger than an S rank. And the worst part? It had followed the dragon's scent. The words hit the protagonist like a hammer. The tiny dragon's voice hardened. The Evas roaming Earth weren't just random threats. Most of them were ones that it had personally fought before arriving here. Now, sensing that it was weakened, they had come back to finish the job. And since its body was now a part of the protagonist, that meant the Eva was after him too. Outside, the wind howled as the Eva slammed its massive limbs against the ice barrier. Cracks spiderwebbed across the thick frozen wall as the impact sent tremors through the entire building. Orion gritted her teeth, forcing more power into her shield. This was the absolute ice wall, the strongest defensive technique she had, one that even S-rank Evas had never broken before. And yet, the cracks were spreading. A second later, the wall shattered. Ignoring his own fear, he lunged forward and pushed Orion out of the way. He shouted for her to escape, realizing that the monster was after him, not her. But Orion was not one to back down. Even as she steadied herself from the sudden push, her icy blue eyes burned with determination. She refused to run. No matter what the circumstances were, no matter how powerful the enemy, she was an S-ranker of the 8th Special Forces. It was her duty to protect humanity, and she wasn't about to abandon her mission. Ice surged around her as she unleashed her next attack. With a fierce battle cry, she summoned 1,000 ice pillars sharp as spears and sent them hurtling toward the Eva. The deadly spikes pierced through the creature's body, impaling it from all sides. The sheer force of the attack sent frost and shattered ice flying through the air. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then, to her horror, the creature moved. The ice spikes remained lodged in its body, yet the Eva stood completely unaffected. It hadn't even flinched. Orion's confidence wavered as she watched in disbelief. The ice pillars she had summoned, meant to pierce and immobilize the creature, had vanished entirely. There was no sign of shattered remains or any resistance. It was as if they had been erased from existence. The monster, unfazed by her attack, shifted its focus. Its dark form pulsed with energy, preparing to retaliate. Orion quickly assessed the situation, her mind racing for a countermeasure. But even she could sense it. This was bad. If her strongest abilities weren't effective, then how were they supposed to fight this thing? Without hesitation, she positioned herself in front of the protagonist, ordering him to stay behind her. Meanwhile, the mini-dragon, who had been observing the battle closely, saw an opportunity. It wasn't interested in heroics or unnecessary risks. With the monster's attention momentarily fixed on Orion, it urged the protagonist to escape. This was their chance to slip away unnoticed. There was no point in engaging an opponent they couldn't defeat, and running was the best option for survival. But the protagonist didn't listen. Instead of retreating, he charged forward with reckless determination, aiming directly for the monster's leg. His goal was simple: knock it off balance. If he could make it fall, then perhaps they could buy some time. Orion, seeing his actions, panicked. She knew all too well the difference in power between them and the monster. Without any special ability, the protagonist was little more than a fragile human in comparison. She yelled for him to stop, urging him to run before it was too late. But the protagonist only smiled. He wasn't acting out of blind arrogance or overconfidence. He knew he was weak, but if the creature was after him, then it was his responsibility to act. If it meant keeping others safe, then he would be its opponent. His bold move caught the monster's attention. The bird-like creature's glowing eyes locked onto him, its focus shifting away from Aureen. He had succeeded in drawing its gaze, but now he had to figure out what to do next. His eyes darted around the battlefield. That's when he noticed the broken window on the hospital wall. If he could leap through it and land on the tree outside, he might be able to escape into the forest, away from populated areas. It was a risky plan, but there were no other options. The mini-dragon, now furious, berated him for his reckless thinking. What if he didn't make the jump? What if he miscalculated and fell? This wasn't just his body anymore, it belonged to the dragon as well. If he got himself killed, they were both done for. But the protagonist wasn't deterred. He dismissed the dragon's concerns, arguing that this was their only choice. Without another moment of hesitation, he lunged toward the window and jumped. The moment his feet left the ground, something unexpected happened. Instead of a simple leap, he soared high into the sky, far beyond what any normal human should be capable of. The power within him, borrowed from the dragon, had activated unintentionally, launching him upwards with astonishing force. For a brief moment, he was weightless. The sensation of flight filled him with exhilaration, his previous worries momentarily drowned out by the sheer thrill of being airborne. The wind rushed past him, and for the first time, he truly felt what it was like to defy gravity. But then reality crashed back in. He had no control. The ground was rapidly approaching and panic set in. He had no idea how to land safely. The excitement faded, replaced by fear. What if he crashed? What if he shattered every bone in his body upon impact? The mini-dragon, despite its usual snarky demeanor, took charge. It ordered him to calm down and focus. Panic wouldn't help. He needed to concentrate on his landing. The protagonist took a deep breath, channeling his thoughts toward his legs. The dragon's power was still within him, and if he focused, maybe he could control how he landed. The impact came fast, but to his surprise, it wasn't painful. He landed with a force that sent dust and debris flying, forming a small crater beneath his feet. Yet, he felt no pain, not even a scratch. Confused, he opened his eyes and examined himself. How was this possible? He had just fallen from such an insane height, yet he was completely unharmed. The mini-dragon, now irritated, explained. It had lent him its power, allowing him to survive the fall unscathed. The protagonist barely had time to process this new revelation when a chilling sensation washed over him. The monster was coming. The enormous bird-like creature had taken flight and was now heading directly toward him. Its massive wings cast an ominous shadow over the ground, and the air vibrated with the force of its movements. There was no time to think. He turned and ran. The sound of the creature's pursuit was deafening, each wing beat sending tremors through the earth. No matter how fast he ran, it was closing in. The realization struck him like a hammer. He couldn't escape on foot. At this rate, it would catch him in mere moments. Then, the mini-dragon spoke again. But this time, its voice carried a different tone. There was a sharp edge to it, a hint of something almost sinister. So, it proposed a deal. If the protagonist handed over full control of his body, the dragon would ensure their survival. It would take care of the monster, wipe it out completely. But if he refused, then everyone here, Aureen, the hospital, the entire area, would be reduced to nothing. The monster was more than capable of obliterating everything in its path. The choice was his. Either surrender his body to the dragon, or watch everything around him be destroyed. The tension between the protagonist and the mini-dragon escalated as the battlefield became increasingly chaotic. The dragon, with a sinister glint in its eyes, urged him once more, hand over control. It was a simple offer. If he allowed the dragon to take over, it would eliminate the monstrous bird without hesitation. But the protagonist hesitated. The words unsettled him. The mini-dragon, growing impatient, clarified that the body originally belonged to it. Ever since it had been sealed within him, it had been forced into a powerless state. But now, It could feel the energy flowing through him. The earlier jump had been proof. Its power was still intact. It had lent that strength to the protagonist, allowing him to survive the fall. Without it, he would have plummeted to his death. However, there was no time to dwell on the details. The monstrous bird was relentless, continuing its pursuit with unwavering aggression. The ground shook under the force of its attacks as the protagonist barely managed to evade its strikes. The dragon's voice cut through the chaos, demanding urgency. If he didn't make a decision soon, he would die. Yet, even as he ran, the protagonist's mind remained firm. Giving control to the strongest species, that was absurd. He tightened his grip on the small dragon in his hands, glaring at it with unwavering resolve. There was no way he would allow such a thing to happen. He hadn't forgotten what the dragon had done in the past, the destruction it had caused at Hachi School. Before he could dwell on the thought, disaster struck. A searing blast of energy erupted from the monster's mouth, the heat searing the air as it raced toward him. The protagonist barely managed to dodge in time, the sheer force of the attack sending shockwaves across the battlefield. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. That had been close, too close. The monstrous bird had no hesitation, no restraint. It was going to obliterate him without a second thought. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. The protagonist's breath caught as his eyes darted toward the source. A woman, still in a wheelchair, had not managed to evacuate in time. She was trapped, completely exposed to the ongoing battle. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. If she was caught in the crossfire, she wouldn't survive. The monstrous bird, sensing weakness, changed course. Its massive wings flared as it shifted its attention toward the helpless woman. Panic surged through the protagonist. He had gotten distracted for just a moment, and now someone's life was on the line. Gritting his teeth, he cursed the creature and shouted, trying to divert its attention back to himself. He had no idea if his voice alone would be enough, but he had to try. The mini-dragon, now seething with frustration, berated him for his recklessness. This was unnecessary. He was putting himself at risk again when he could have simply handed over his body and let the dragon handle it. Yet, despite its scolding, the protagonist refused to back down. The realization hit him like a brick. If his body truly was made from the strongest species, then he should have the power to fight back. Clenching his fist, he made his decision. He charged toward the monstrous bird and delivered a punch with all his strength, and then nothing. The impact was meaningless. The bird barely reacted, its body completely unfazed. The protagonist staggered back in disbelief. How could that be? He had expected at least some effect, but it was as if he had punched solid stone. The mini-dragon let out a sharp, irritated sigh. This was exactly what it had warned him about. Without its will, the protagonist was nothing more than a regular human. Strength alone wasn't enough. Power without direction was meaningless. But there was no time for explanations. The bird monster's energy flared once again, signaling another attack. A second atomic breath was forming, its glow illuminating the battlefield with a deadly radiance. The protagonist's pulse quickened. This was bad. This time, there was no way he could dodge. The mini-dragon's voice took on a new level of seriousness. One last time, it demanded an answer. If the protagonist surrendered control, the dragon would take care of the monster. Otherwise, everything in the hospital, everyone still inside, would be wiped out in an instant. The attack was moments away from being unleashed. The dragon shouted in frustration, urging him to hurry up. There was no time left. If he hesitated any longer, it would be too late. But instead of conceding, the protagonist did something unexpected. Grabbing the mini-dragon tightly in both hands, he pressed its face against his palms. With unwavering determination, he called out the dragon's title mockingly. The reason this entire situation had happened in the first place was because of it. It had drawn the monster here. It had caused all this chaos. and now it wanted to take his body for its own gain. He wasn't going to let that happen. Instead, he was going to use the dragon's power on his terms. The monster's attack reached its peak. A blinding surge of energy erupted from its beak, hurtling toward them with catastrophic force. The mini-dragon, utterly exasperated, screamed in disbelief. The protagonist had lost his mind. If he wasn't careful, they were all going to be annihilated. Yet even as destruction loomed over them, the protagonist stood firm. As the battle raged on, the protagonist stood his ground, a smirk forming on his face despite the overwhelming danger. He had pushed himself to the absolute limit, and yet the mini-dragon, however, had no intention of perishing alongside a stubborn fool. Panic surged through it as the monstrous bird's devastating attack inched closer. It screamed in frustration, realizing that if it didn't act, they would both be incinerated. With no other choice, it ordered the protagonist to extend his right hand. Just this once, it would lend him its power, but only a little. Without hesitation, the mini-dragon dove into the black void that had formed in the protagonist's palm. The moment it disappeared, a rush of energy unlike anything he had ever felt surged through him. It started deep in his core, welling up from the pit of his stomach and spreading through his limbs like fire coursing through his veins. This was raw power, pure and untamed. For the first time, he truly felt it. With newfound resolve, he aimed his attack skyward, preparing to unleash everything at just the right moment. The system, responding to the surge of energy, displayed a warning. It announced the controlled release of power from the strongest species, an infinitesimally small fraction, barely 0.0001% of its full potential. Yet, even that minuscule amount was overwhelming. As he clenched his fist, a blinding blue atomic force erupted from his fist, surging forth with devastating intensity. The collision was inevitable. The bird monster had already unleashed its own energy blast. Two incomprehensible forces colliding in an instant, creating a violent explosion that shattered the night sky. The protagonist's power, now fully infused with the will of the strongest species, overwhelmed the monstrous bird's attack entirely. A second later, his blue atomic blast surged forward, smashing into the creature with unstoppable force. The impact was catastrophic. The monstrous bird barely had time to react before it was consumed by the devastating energy. Its massive form was incinerated in an instant, reduced to nothing more than ash in the wind. A single strike, one attack, had obliterated an extraterrestrial life form of unimaginable power. A stunned silence followed. The battlefield, which had moments ago been filled with deafening chaos, now stood eerily quiet. From a distance, the woman in the wheelchair had witnessed everything. She had watched in awe as the monstrous being had been erased from existence, leaving nothing behind. A soft smile formed on her lips. The system, ever precise, immediately registered the change. It announced the termination of the limited power release, restoring the protagonist to his normal state. The overwhelming energy that had filled him moments ago vanished, leaving behind only exhaustion. The protagonist, still reeling from the experience, could hardly believe what had just happened. But before he could dwell on it any longer, his body gave in. The strain of wielding such immense energy took its toll. His vision blurred, and his strength abandoned him. His knees buckled, and before he could catch himself, he collapsed. The woman, seeing him fall, called out his name in alarm. Without hesitation, she rushed toward him. As she reached his unconscious form, her gaze flickered toward the lifeless remains of the monstrous bird. Confusion filled her mind. Something wasn't right. She recognized that creature. She had seen it before. It was the same extraterrestrial being, Eva, from earlier. But how? How had it been taken down so effortlessly? Her thoughts raced. And then, realization struck her like a thunderbolt. Kuraboshi, this boy, wasn't supposed to have any abilities. He wasn't supposed to possess an alpha-level power. He was meant to be ordinary. And yet what she had just witnessed proved otherwise. This child was something entirely different. The dim glow of overhead lights illuminated the room, focusing entirely on the lone figure seated in the center. Slowly, the protagonist, Kuroboshi, stirred, his consciousness returning from the abyss of exhaustion. As his senses adjusted, a pleasant aroma filled his nostrils, warm, rich, and soothing. He instinctively took a deep breath, momentarily disoriented. The scent was oddly comforting, yet unfamiliar. As his vision cleared, he took in his surroundings. Across from him stood an imposing man, an aged yet powerful figure, exuding an aura of discipline and authority. His uniform was pristine, his stance firm, and by his side, a gleaming Japanese katana rested in its sheath. The man was carefully pouring tea into a delicate porcelain cup, an oddly serene action considering the tension in the air. Without hesitation, the stranger offered him a cup. The simple gesture contrasted sharply with the intimidating presence he commanded. Kuroboshi's mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. Who was this man? And more importantly, where was he? His last memory was of the battle. Sensing his confusion, the man spoke with measured calmness, apologizing for the lack of immediate explanation. He revealed that Kuroboshi had been on the brink of death following his battle against the extraterrestrial threat. In response, he had been taken into their care and brought to a secure location. This place, the man explained, was the Hachi School's underground training facility, a shelter designed for VIPs during EVA attacks. Boasting humanity's strongest defensive measures, it was capable of withstanding attacks from both within and outside. Then, the man introduced himself, Nishiki Ryogen, an S-ranker, the commander of the 8th Special Forces and the principal of the 8th Special Forces Training School. At the mention of his name, recognition sparked in Kuroboshi's eyes. Nishiki Ryogen wasn't just anyone. He was a legend, a warrior who had single-handedly defeated the strongest species that had ravaged Tokyo 8 years ago. He was considered the country's most powerful special soldier, an undefeated force against the EVA threat. But then, Nishiki added something unexpected. He wasn't just the school's principal, he was technically Kuroboshi's superior as well, considering Kuroboshi's position as a janitor at Hachi School. The remark carried a subtle reprimand, reminding him to show the proper respect. Meanwhile, the tiny dragon within Kuroboshi's hand stirred nervously. The moment it laid eyes on Nishiki, a deep sense of dread settled in. This was not someone it could trifle with. Compared to Nishiki's sheer presence, the mini-dragon knew it stood no chance in its current state. Shaking off his initial shock, Kuroboshi refocused. His mind still swirled with questions, the most pressing being, why were they in the underground training facility? His answer came in the form of familiar voices. Turning to the side, he saw Orine, the ice princess, approaching him, relief evident in her expression. With a warm smile, she assured him of his safety. The sight of a familiar face amidst the unfamiliar surroundings brought him some comfort. He greeted her back, albeit still puzzled. Then, another figure emerged, a young woman in a wheelchair. Recognition dawned on Kuroboshi. Unagi Senri, the girl he had helped at the hospital during the EVA attack. He immediately recalled how she had been caught in the middle of the chaos, nearly falling victim to the monstrous birds' rampage. Seeing her now, unharmed, was a strange relief. Senri, in turn, introduced herself properly this time. She was an A-ranker and expressed gratitude for his assistance during the attack. It became clear that she was more than just a random bystander. She was part of this organization, deeply involved in whatever operation was unfolding behind the scenes. Still confused, Kuroboshi questioned why a Hachi School student like her had been caught in such an incident. However, before he could voice further concerns, she answered indirectly, explaining that everyone present, except herself, were top-ranking operatives. The revelation only deepened his curiosity. Before he could dwell on it further, Nishiki took control of the conversation once more. Now that the introductions were done, it was time to address the real issue at hand. But before doing so, he casually invited Kuroboshi to partake in some snacks he had prepared himself. Kuroboshi hesitated, eyeing the tray of adorably shaped cookies. For someone as battle-hardened and intimidating as Nishiki Ryugen, the contrast was almost comical. The sight of the tough-as-nails warrior crafting delicate cookies did not match his fearsome reputation at all. Still, hunger won over his skepticism. As he took a bite, he couldn't deny it. The cookies were delicious. But the pleasant moment was short-lived. Nishiki abruptly shifted the conversation to the core issue. Kuroboshi had devoured the strongest species and now wielded its elemental power. The words hit Kuroboshi like a shockwave. He hadn't expected them to know. Instinctively, he almost choked on his drink, immediately glancing toward Orin, the ice princess. Had she betrayed his secret? But before he could accuse her, Nishiki dismissed his suspicions. Hyuga had said nothing. They had been monitoring him. At this, the atmosphere grew tense. Kuroboshi's expression hardened. The revelation of being under surveillance put him on edge. However, Nishiki continued, explaining something far more critical, the nature of the mysterious substance known as element. Element was the extraterrestrial energy source brought by the Eva species from space. It was the very foundation of human alpha abilities, granting them their powers. However, human technology was incapable of detecting it. Even top-ranked fighters could only faintly sense its presence. But Unagi Senri, she was different. Her alpha ability was rare and unique. Unlike others, she could see and analyze element, making her a vital asset to their operations. That was why she had been assigned to monitor Kuroboshi. His encounter with her at the hospital had not been a mere coincidence. It was a test to confirm the impossible, his ability to devour the strongest species. The conversation turned grim. Nishiki explained the history of the strongest Eva, a creature that had appeared alone in Tokyo 8 years ago. Its devastation had been unprecedented, its power likened to that of a nuclear warhead. The recent Eva that had attacked was initially mistaken for the same creature, proving just how dangerous such entities were. Then, without warning, Nishiki drew his katana. In an instant, the blade was at Kuroboshi's throat. The room fell silent. Nishiki's expression remained unreadable, but his intent was clear. As the principal's sword pressed against the dragon boy's neck, the tension in the room thickened. The air was so heavy it could probably crush a lesser man's ego, and that's saying something. The principal, with a gaze as sharp as his blade, made it clear that if there was even a sliver of risk, it was his sworn duty to eliminate it. The dragon boy's heart pounded, his thoughts racing. Just moments ago, the principal had been calmly sipping tea, but now he was a blur of movement. It was like dealing with a deadly samurai who could go from Zen master to final boss in an instant. Despite the fear, the dragon boy couldn't help but admire the sheer skill. But admiration wasn't going to stop the sword from closing in. That's when Orin, with her usual grace and composure, interjected. Her voice echoed through the tense atmosphere as she presented a counter-argument. If the strongest species' powers had truly emerged in the boy, it was likely that more threats could follow. Using him as a weapon, humanity's very own nuke with curly hair might be their best shot at survival. The principal lowered his blade, considering her words. It wasn't exactly a comforting resolution, though. After all, trusting a teenager with world-ending powers was like giving a toddler the launch codes, only slightly more terrifying. The principal acknowledged Orin's logic, but remained cautious. He declared that proper observation was necessary, and who better to handle that than Unagi, the cheerful and slightly unsettling rancor with a smile that could make even demons second-guess their choices. With the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she enjoyed her job a little too much, Unagi approached the dragon boy. Her delicate hands grabbed his, but it wasn't exactly a tender moment. The boy winced, questioning her intentions. She cheerfully informed him that his element level had dropped to 0, like a spent battery, or a washed-up rock star trying to stage a comeback. The mini dragon within him squirmed in discomfort. Facing off against a bird monster was one thing, but being manhandled by a giddy, creepy-eyed rancor, that was a whole new level of psychological warfare. Unagi then removed her eye patch, revealing her glowing eye, a sign of her rare and powerful ability. She was about to peer into the very fabric of his existence, as if the Dragon Boy was a cosmic mystery waiting to be unraveled. And while she marveled at the thought of exploring the universe within him, the Dragon Boy could only hope that his insides didn't resemble a questionable late-night snack. Unagi Senri placed her forehead against the protagonist, Gui's, in a ritual-like manner. She prepared to activate her ability, a celestial observation, designed to peer into the inner universe of an individual. She were about to crack open the mysteries of his very existence. With a surge of power, her glowing eyes shone, and in an instant, she found herself transported to an entirely different realm within her mind. The space she entered was vast and infinite, resembling a cosmic void. Countless twinkling stars illuminated the darkness like fragments of scattered memories. Unagi marveled at the sight, understanding that these glowing particles represented the elemental energy within Gui's body. Though it was often believed that the boy lacked any alpha abilities, the mere presence of these elements suggested otherwise. However, what was most alarming was the meager amount of energy compared to others. It was like staring into a night sky where only a few stars managed to shine. As she scanned the dark abyss, something caught her attention, a subtle movement. At first, she assumed the elements were merely drifting, like dust in the wind. But upon closer examination, a horrifying realization struck her. The elements weren't merely moving, they were being devoured. The blackness wasn't just empty space, it was a force, an unstoppable pull. Panic set in as Unagi understood the truth. Gui's alpha ability was no ordinary power. It was a black hole, an abyss that consumed everything in its path. The sheer gravitational force was relentless. Struggling to maintain her composure, Unagi's heart pounded. The swirling darkness had begun tugging at her very being, its force threatening to pull her into its depths. She tried to resist, but her limbs felt heavy, as if the void itself was binding her. For a moment, her panic peaked. She couldn't escape. She was moments away from becoming a permanent resident of the nothingness. It wasn't exactly how she imagined her day would go. 1 minute, enjoying a peaceful tea break. The next, getting sucked into the protagonist's internal black hole. Talk about workplace hazards. Desperately, she fought against the force. The sensation was overwhelming, like being dragged into a cosmic vacuum. But just as she feared the inevitable, the pull weakened. She stumbled, gasping for breath as the darkness released its grip. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. Something else stirred within the void. Before she could even catch her breath, Unagi's eyes locked onto a massive black sphere, hovering ominously in the distance. The unsettling energy it radiated sent shivers down her spine. Yet it wasn't just the sphere that made her uneasy. Emerging from the shadows was something far more terrifying. The form of the strongest species. The dragon, once believed to be defeated, now loomed large. Its golden eyes gleamed with ancient malice as it bared its jagged teeth. Without hesitation, it lunged towards her, jaws wide open, ready to devour. In that split second, Unagi's instincts kicked in. She shouted, desperately invoking the cancellation of her celestial observation. Her surroundings warped and twisted, and with a jarring snap, she was yanked back to reality. Her body trembled as she gasped for air, beads of sweat dripping from her forehead. The panic was still evident on her face as she processed the traumatic encounter. Oreen, who had been watching in concern, immediately rushed to Yunagi's side. She noticed the way her friend's hands shook, her breathing ragged. The protagonist, Gui, looked equally perplexed, wondering what had just transpired. He had barely felt anything during the observation, yet Yunagi's reaction suggested she had faced something far more intense. The principal, ever composed, casually offered Yunagi a cup of tea, suggesting it would help her calm down. However, Oreen quickly pointed out the unfortunate reality. It was merely water, not tea. After all, it wasn't every day someone nearly got swallowed by a metaphorical black hole and lived to tell the tale. A glass of water wasn't exactly the comfort drink of choice, but it would have to do. Yunagi's trembling hands wrapped around the cup as she tried to steady herself. Despite her best efforts, the lingering fear refused to dissipate. The principal's stern voice broke through the tension as he calmly inquired about her findings. She hesitated for a moment before gathering the strength to speak. She explained that Gui's alpha ability was indeed a black hole, a force so powerful that it consumed even his own elements. This explained why previous assessments had shown him as having zero elemental energy. He was effectively his own worst enemy, draining himself without even realizing it. But what stood out the most was the confirmation of his earlier claims. The strongest species, believed to have been destroyed, was not gone. It was imprisoned within the abyss of Gui's black hole. The principal's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. The implications were daunting. Gui wasn't just a survivor, he was a walking time bomb. One wrong move, and the monstrous force within him could break free. And let's be honest, it wasn't like having an ancient, terrifying dragon as your unwanted internal roommate was exactly ideal. Not even a bucket of ice cream could fix that level of stress. Yunagi Senri was visibly shaken, her heart still pounding from the terrifying encounter within Gui's mind. She quickly explained how the dragon had attacked her, its monstrous form proving the sheer ferocity of the strongest species. The principal's face darkened with resolve. Without wasting a moment, his hand moved swiftly, and in the blink of an eye, his katana gleamed against the protagonist's neck. The sudden escalation sent shockwaves through the room. Oreen gasped, her voice trembling as she tried to reason with the principal. Her protests fell on deaf ears. The principal's reasoning was harsh but logical. If the strongest species inside Gui's black hole could act aggressively even in its sealed state, then there was a possibility it could break free. And if that happened, the consequences would be catastrophic. For him, eliminating the threat now was a necessary act of caution, a grim responsibility as the nation's strongest S-ranker. Meanwhile, the miniature dragon, who had been observing the events with growing fear, suddenly spoke. Panic-stricken, it urged Gui to retaliate. Offering its power, it tempted him with the promise of strength, insisting they needed to act to survive. Yunagi quickly analyzed the situation, explaining that the small dragon likely represented the soul of the strongest species. When Gui absorbed the dragon's body into the black hole, its soul had been separated and remained outside, and the principal was not one to rely on promises alone. Without warning, the principal pulled back his katana, then slashed. Blood splattered across the room as the blade struck Gui, his body staggering from the impact. The sharp sting of pain was immediate, but the physical wound was nothing compared to the chaos it unleashed. The miniature dragon roared in fury, its small form trembling with uncontained rage. It cursed the principal, its primal instincts flaring as it demanded vengeance. Despite its tiny size, the sheer force of its anger was enough to fill the room with dread. Then, something shifted. A radiant light began to emanate from Gui's body, glowing with an overwhelming intensity. The aura pulsed like a heartbeat, expanding and contracting, as if the energy within him had finally been stirred awake. Unagi's eyes widened in shock. The energy was unlike anything she had seen before, a swirling mass of elements that surged beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just a trickle of power, it was a storm. She quickly assessed the rising force, concluding that it was no ordinary spike in energy. The elemental level had surpassed the S+ rank, reaching the caliber of Eva or higher. The principal, though visibly concerned, remained stoic. His voice was cold and resolute as he issued the order. Gui was to be eliminated. There was no other choice. From his perspective, the existence of such unstable, uncontrollable power was too great a risk. The surge of blue aura from Gui's body only confirmed the worst fears. It wasn't just a dormant strength. It was a force that could potentially rival the strongest species that had ever threatened humanity. A brilliant blue aura enveloped Gui's body, radiating an intense light that filled the space. The air grew thick with pressure as gusts of wind swirled around him, making it difficult to stand. The principal's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. It had come to this. The worst-case scenario. Gui, now officially classified as the strongest species, stood at the center of a storm of raw, uncontrollable energy. With a grim determination, the principal knew what had to be done. Unagi, still recovering from her experience inside Gui's black hole, quickly noticed something alarming. The energy levels from the strongest species sealed within him were increasing at a rapid pace. If it continued unchecked, the dragon could break free. He firmly believed that eliminating Gui before the species escaped was the only way to ensure humanity's safety. Without hesitation, the principal drew his katana once again. The polished blade gleamed in the presence of the swirling blue light. His mind was set. He would strike Gui down before the dormant monster within could be released. Launching himself forward, the principal closed the distance with staggering speed. As he brought down his sword, the air trembled from the force of his attack. The blade met the barrier of light surrounding Gui, creating a powerful burst of wind that sent shockwaves through the room. Unagi watched in awe. The principal's sword technique, infused with the immense energy of star elements, was a force to be reckoned with. His strikes were sharp and deliberate, cutting through the air with precision. Yet despite the relentless onslaught, Gui remained unscathed. The radiant blue light acted as a protective barrier, absorbing each strike like an impenetrable shield. It was like trying to poke a hole through a thundercloud, futile and a little foolish. The principal, however, wasn't one to give up easily. His experienced eyes noticed something peculiar. Within the glow of the blue aura, the vague outline of a dragon's face emerged. Its fearsome eyes and gaping mouth flickered like a mirage, as if the sealed species within was peering out. The sight unsettled him. Even without a special ability to sense star elements, the raw energy was so immense that he could perceive it with the naked eye. But rather than falter, the principal pressed on, determined to overpower it. With each strike, he pushed harder, determined to overwhelm the protective force through sheer willpower. The sound of metal clashing against energy echoed like distant thunder. Yet no matter how many times he swung, the result remained the same. The dragon's face continued to linger undeterred. The frustration was palpable. Even the strongest warrior in humanity seemed powerless against this monstrous force. Aurine, witnessing the fierce battle, felt torn. She wanted to support the principal, but the memory of Gui's selflessness gnawed at her. He had once risked his own life to protect her, and now she stood frozen, unable to decide. Despite the internal conflict, one thing was certain. The principal needed all the help he could get. Suddenly, a black hole materialized in Gui's palm. The miniature dragon, now shrouded in the same blue aura, emerged once again. Its tiny form contrasted sharply against the overwhelming energy around it. With a smug tone, it mocked the situation. Was this really humanity's strongest? The disbelief in its voice was evident. The principal, however, merely smirked in response. If the miniature dragon thought he had shown his full strength, it was sorely mistaken. Deciding to put an end to the battle once and for all, the principal resolved to go all out. The air shifted as his katana began to glow with a golden light, the energy coursing through the blade like a raging current. It radiated a fierce brilliance, illuminating the surroundings as the pressure intensified. A tornado of energy spiraled around the sword, amplifying its destructive power. The sight was nothing short of breathtaking and terrifying. The miniature dragon, despite its bravado, couldn't hide its excitement. The principal's escalating power brought a gleam to its eyes, almost as if it relished the thrill of the confrontation. As the battle raged on, the atmosphere grew heavier. Unagi watched in concern, sensing the star element in the space rapidly gathering into the principal's sword. The sheer density of the energy was overwhelming, and it was clear that the next clash would determine the outcome. Yet, the stakes couldn't be higher. The principal, with his glowing golden katana, seemed determined to end this fight once and for all. However, Gui's power was becoming even more unstable. Orion's desperate voice broke through the tense air. She called out to Gui, pleading for him to regain control. Her words echoed with frustration and hope, reminding him of the promise he had made, the resolve to never be swayed by the strongest species. But Gui remained silent, his body still wrapped in the blinding blue aura. The energy thickened further until a monstrous sight emerged from his palm. A massive dragon's mouth materialized, glowing ominously with malicious intent. It was as if the sealed, strongest species within him had decided to make its move. With a deep, guttural laugh, the dragon reveled in its newfound freedom. Its twisted amusement was evident as it taunted the humans, daring them to face it. Without hesitation, the dragon lunged forward, jaws wide open, aiming to consume everything in its path. The principal, unfazed, stood his ground. His katana shone brighter, pulsating with the immense energy he had gathered. The collision was inevitable. The moment their powers met, a violent shockwave erupted, sending tremors through the space. The golden light of the principal's sword clashed fiercely against the dragon's overwhelming energy. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the principal might prevail. But the sheer magnitude of the dragon's strength was too much. The force of the collision overwhelmed him, and with a thunderous crack, his katana shattered. Shards of the once proud weapon scattered through the air. The principal staggered back, stunned. His strongest attack had failed. The dragon's eyes gleamed with sinister delight. Emitting a radiant blue flame, it unleashed its full form. The aura that surrounded it twisted and flickered like ghostly fire, and its sharp teeth glistened menacingly. It was a manifestation of pure, destructive power. The dragon mockingly acknowledged its victory, declaring that it had enjoyed the little sparring session. But now, it was time for a more gruesome end. In a moment of triumph, the dragon lunged at the principal, its gaping mouth ready to tear him apart. Orin and Unagi's panicked screams rang through the air, fearing the worst. Yet, just as the beast was about to sink its fangs into its prey, an unexpected twist occurred. A sudden crash echoed through the space, followed by a muffled groan from the dragon. When the dust settled, the sight that greeted them was nothing short of absurd. The dragon's enormous head was comically wedged into the ceiling. Its glowing eyes darted around in confusion, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. With a bewildered snarl, it grumbled, questioning why everything had suddenly gone dark. The terrifying force that had just moments ago declared its dominance now flailed helplessly, stuck like a poorly planned home renovation gone wrong. It was as if the universe itself had decided that the dragon's theatrics needed a punchline. The principal, still catching his breath, gazed at the ridiculous scene in disbelief. Then the realization struck: Gui was back in control. Despite the immense power of the strongest species, Gui had managed to outwit it. By using their shared connection, he manipulated the dragon's body to slam directly into the ceiling. It was a simple yet effective move, proving that brute strength wasn't everything. With a sly smirk, Gui faced the principal, who was still reeling from the bizarre turn of events. The principal demanded to know who he was truly facing: the strongest species or the human who had just bested it. Guy's grin widened. He reminded the principal of his unwavering resolve. He had made it clear from the beginning that he would not be swayed by the temptation of the strongest species. Even with the odds stacked against him, he remained true to himself. After regaining control of his body, Gui stood firmly, his composure restored. The principal, still processing the astonishing turn of events, couldn't hide his surprise. Despite the overwhelming presence of the strongest species that had nearly consumed him, Gui managed to subdue it once again. Without hesitation, he pulled the mini dragon, now reduced from its terrifying form, toward him. The once fearsome beast now squirmed in his grasp, its defiance fading in the face of Gui's authority. Holding the mini dragon firmly, Guy's stern expression darkened as he reminded it of the consequences of disobedience. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling resolve, sending a chill down the creature's spine. The dragon, still traumatized by the memory of being devoured, visibly recoiled. Any remnant of pride it had was crushed under the weight of that lingering fear. Guy's intimidating glare was enough to reduce the creature to a trembling mess. A bead of sweat rolled down the dragon's forehead as it stammered out promises of obedience, desperately avoiding further punishment. It was like a rebellious toddler finally realizing that throwing tantrums would only lead to a timeout, except in this case, the timeout involved the terrifying prospect of being consumed once again. With a reluctant whimper, the mini dragon squeezed itself back into the black hole in Gui's palm. Despite the confidence he displayed, Gui couldn't help but internally acknowledge his lack of understanding regarding his own abilities. The black hole, a manifestation of his alpha ability, remained a mystery to him. Her gaze lingered on Gui, who had now become something more than a mere human. The star element that had once surged uncontrollably through his body had completely vanished. He was now labeled an unranked existence, a term both ominous and enigmatic. The principal, his earlier worry replaced with a wide grin, burst into laughter. With great enthusiasm, he declared Gui's success. From the brink of unconsciousness to the ceiling of the strongest species, Guy's actions had exceeded expectations. What was initially a catastrophic scenario had transformed into an impressive demonstration of resilience. Without hesitation, the principal officially approved Gui's special enrollment into Hachi school. Guy, however, stood puzzled. The mention of his enrollment was unexpected, leaving him momentarily speechless. The principal explained that the entire confrontation had served as a test. The presence of the strongest species was not just a threat, but a potential future enemy. Humanity sought a counterbalance, someone who could control such power. By taming the strongest species without causing harm, Gui had proven his capability. While the principal's motives were clear, Gui couldn't ignore the bitter sense of manipulation. He accepted the challenge without complaint, determined to contribute in any way possible. Whether it meant cleaning the halls or assisting others, he was willing to support those who fought for humanity's survival. And should his abilities manifest one day, he would use them to protect others. It was an unexpectedly mature response, the kind that most people twice Guy's age would struggle to muster. Even the principal seemed taken aback by his unwavering determination. Perhaps this was why Gui had been chosen, not for his strength, but for his resilience and sense of responsibility. With the decision made, the principal approached Gui, offering to heal the injuries caused by his earlier sword strike. But to his astonishment, the wound had already vanished. The flesh had mended itself, leaving no trace of the previous injury. Guy's body, altered by the essence of the strongest species, now possessed remarkable regenerative abilities. While the rapid healing was a blessing in the moment, the implications of his body's transformation were unsettling. The principal's sharp gaze lingered on him, silently acknowledging the potential danger. Her status as the top student at Hachi School made her the perfect candidate to guide Gui through the unfamiliar environment. With a sense of duty, Orin accepted the responsibility. Though her face remained composed, a glimmer of curiosity flickered in her eyes. The unpredictable nature of Gui's abilities and the lingering presence of the strongest species made him a subject of both intrigue and concern. After the principal's bold declaration of Kuroboshi's special enrollment, he turned to Senri, assigning her a new task. She was to change classes and keep a close eye on Kuroboshi. The mere thought of observing the strongest species thrilled her. Her face lit up with enthusiasm as she declared her resolve to watch Kuroboshi closely, determined not to miss a single move. It was as if she had been handed a front-row ticket to a dangerous yet exhilarating show. Even the mini dragon, still peeking nervously from the black hole in Kuroboshi's hand, couldn't hide its dread. Its trembling voice expressed genuine concern about how terrifying Senri could be, even compared to the protagonist himself. As Kuroboshi and Senri continued their light-hearted exchange, the principal leaned toward Orin with a mischievous glint in his eye. He remarked how things were about to become far more entertaining. The principal, never one to shy away from enjoying the moment, retrieved his tea thermos. Offering a cup to Orin, he flashed a grin. She politely declined, finding the entire situation amusing. His insistence on sipping tea in the middle of a serious conversation made the scene feel absurd, as if he were treating the fate of humanity like a casual afternoon break. One could almost expect him to pull out a plate of biscuits next. But beneath his nonchalant facade, the principal's words grew grave. He warned Orin of the risks that came with harboring the strongest species. If Kuroboshi ever lost control, she was tasked with eliminating both him and the creature. The weight of this responsibility struck her hard. It wasn't a simple order. It was a burden that only an S-ranker like her could bear. Her initial shock turned to quiet determination as she processed the gravity of her role. Even though the principal assured her that he would handle it if present, his frequent absences on higher-ranked missions meant the responsibility would inevitably fall on her shoulders. Orin's mind flashed back to her recent encounter with Kuroboshi. She recalled how he had saved her without hesitation, risking his life despite the overwhelming danger. It wasn't easy to reconcile the image of the boy who had selflessly come to her aid with the monstrous entity he carried within. Yet her pledge wasn't solely out of obligation. It was also a way to repay the debt she owed Kuroboshi. If fate demanded she stand against him one day, she would do so without hesitation, ensuring no harm came to others. Her heart may waver, but her resolve would not. The principal, satisfied with her response, nodded approvingly. Then, in his usual unpredictable manner, the principal shifted the tone once again. He called out to Kuroboshi, unleashing a wave of power. The air crackled with energy as he asked Kuroboshi if he could sense it. The protagonist, however, remained unaffected. Despite the sheer force surrounding him, he felt nothing. It was as though his connection to the star elements, the source of alpha abilities, was completely severed. The principal's amused expression hinted at both curiosity and concern. The principal wasted no time, declaring a mission for all present. Their objective was clear: teach Kuroboshi about star elements and alpha abilities before his official enrollment at Hachi School. The room echoed with determined voices as everyone accepted the mission. The next day arrived with an air of anticipation. Kuroboshi, accompanied by the ever-looming presence of his mini-dragon, made his way to the designated training ground. Curiosity and uncertainty mingled in his thoughts. Kuroboshi couldn't help but question what kind of training awaited him here. After all, hot springs weren't typically known for their combat simulations. Then again, Kuroboshi stood in front of the imposing ancient gate of the Marihachi Hot Springs, a puzzled expression on his face. The idea of a hot spring as a special training ground seemed absurd. His mind raced with doubts. Had he misunderstood the directions? Perhaps this was a mistake, or worse, a prank. But before he could dwell on his confusion, the soft clacking of wooden sandals caught his attention. Turning toward the sound, he was greeted by Orin and Senri, both elegantly dressed in traditional kimonos. Their appearance was both beautiful and striking, their vibrant attire emphasizing their graceful charm. The two girls welcomed him cheerfully, announcing that this was indeed the 8th Special Forces training facility. Despite their words, the relaxed, steamy atmosphere and the lingering mist of the hot spring hardly resembled anything close to a rigorous training environment. Kuroboshi's bewilderment only grew as he noticed the girls looked refreshed, as though they had just enjoyed a leisurely soak. He couldn't help but ask if they had already finished their bath, wondering where the so-called special training was supposed to begin. Orin, with an indignant yet playful pout, quickly corrected him, insisting that the hot spring itself was an essential part of their training. Although her words were firm, the sight of her glowing complexion and wet strands of hair suggested otherwise. Kuroboshi's curiosity deepened, but before he could question further, his gaze shifted toward Senri. He immediately recalled her injury from the previous battle and, with concern, asked about her leg. Senri reassured him with a smile, explaining that the principal had used his alpha ability to heal her. What would have taken weeks to recover from had mended in an instant. This miraculous display of power left Kuroboshi both amazed and envious. He couldn't shake the thought that if he could only master his own alpha abilities, perhaps he too could wield such incredible power. Determined, he clutched the mini-dragon tightly in one hand, silently vowing to unlock his potential soon. However, Senri's attention soon shifted to the small creature. Her curiosity and excitement were palpable as she eagerly leaned closer, her fascination with the dragon shining through. Unfortunately for the little creature, her enthusiasm was far from mutual. The dragon trembled in fear, muttering under its breath, referring to Senri as a perverted eye patch woman, before scurrying away to hide. While Kuroboshi couldn't help but find the exchange amusing, Senri's mischievous grin suggested she wasn't done just yet. What followed was perhaps even more unexpected. With a glint of excitement in her eyes, Senri declared her intent to investigate Kuroboshi's alpha ability. Before he could protest, she reached for his hand, her fascination zeroing in on the mysterious black hole embedded within his palm. Without hesitation, she inserted her fingers into it, her satisfaction evident as she exclaimed how it went in. Kuroboshi's reaction was immediate, an uncontrollable burst of laughter. The sensation was overwhelming, ticklish beyond belief, and he pleaded with her to stop. Yet, Senri only grew more amused, inviting Orin to try it as well. Orin, flustered but intrigued, hesitated at the suggestion. She admitted that the mere thought of doing so made her heart race. Kuroboshi, his face now a brilliant shade of red, protested desperately. The absurdity of the situation was undeniable. The mini-dragon intervened. With a fierce chomp, it bit down on Senri's finger, expressing its frustration in no uncertain terms. It berated the girls for their so-called disgusting actions, defending its home from further intrusion. Despite the chaos, Senri remained unfazed. If anything, she seemed more amused than ever. However, her brief experiment had yielded results. She concluded that Kuroboshi's inability to feel her star element energy indicated a major problem. The concern in her voice was evident as she explained that without the ability to sense star elements, Kuroboshi might never awaken his alpha ability. His heart sank at the revelation. After all the battles and challenges he had faced, the thought of never unlocking his true power was crushing. The mini-dragon, however, took the news quite differently. A mischievous grin spread across its tiny face. It gleefully celebrated the idea of Kuroboshi remaining powerless, no doubt reveling in the fact that the terrifying potential of the strongest species. Kuroboshi listened attentively as Orin explained the concept of star elements. Unlike alpha abilities, which were the powerful techniques wielded by the strongest beings, star elements served as the essential energy source to activate those abilities. In simple terms, they were like fuel, the cosmic matter that Evas had brought to Earth upon their arrival. Over time, this mysterious energy had spread everywhere, existing abundantly not only in the environment but also within the bodies of living organisms. Through breathing, eating, and simply existing, humans naturally absorbed and released tiny amounts of star elements. The explanation seemed logical, but Kuroboshi's concern grew when Senri pointed out the main issue. With the decision to begin his training, the three of them entered the Maruhachi Hot Springs facility. The steamy atmosphere was filled with the warmth of natural spring water, and the misty air carried a faint sense of serenity. However, the tranquility didn't last long. Senri, always one to add a playful twist, announced the first step of his training, sensing star elements through the hot spring water. Kuroboshi's curiosity piqued as she approached a nearby water tank, collecting some of the steaming water in a small container. Without hesitation, Orin prepared for her part. Holding her hands above the water, she concentrated, and a visible glow emanated from her palms. She transferred a significant amount of star elements into the water, causing it to shimmer and radiate a mesmerizing light. Senri admired the glowing liquid with satisfaction, commenting on its dense concentration. Meanwhile, Kuroboshi watched in confusion, unable to comprehend what exactly they were doing. Orin explained that by infusing the spring water with star elements, they had created a potent mixture. Drinking it would allow him to experience the presence of star elements firsthand. Kuroboshi's unease grew as she handed him the container, encouraging him to drink it. Her suggestive tone, laced with unnecessary innuendos, earned a flustered reaction from Orin, who protested against her antics. Despite the playful atmosphere, the purpose remained clear. This was a critical part of Kuroboshi's training. Trusting his friends, Kuroboshi resolved to go through with it. He lifted the container, determined to overcome whatever awaited him. With a resolute expression, he declared his intent and took a large gulp of the shimmering liquid. For a brief moment, everything seemed fine. But that moment was short-lived. An intense burning sensation erupted in his throat. The fiery pain coursed down his esophagus, leaving him gasping and choking. Panic seized him as he struggled to catch his breath. Senri, still amused, casually revealed the truth. Concentrated star elements could be poisonous to some people. Her light-hearted remark only fueled Kuroboshi's frustration. The fact that she had conveniently forgotten to mention this crucial detail left him speechless. Through labored breaths, Kuroboshi's mind raced. The burning pain was unbearable, but the thought of failure was even worse. Senri's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that this experience was a rite of passage for students at Hachi School. If he wanted to stand among them and unlock his true potential, he had to endure. Determined to prove his resilience, Kuroboshi fought against the agony. His resolve strengthened as he reminded himself of his goal. The girls, witnessing his unwavering spirit, cheered him on. Their words of encouragement reignited his determination, and despite the lingering pain, he clenched his fists and stood tall. Then, without warning, a sudden warmth began to spread through his body. It was different from the painful burning sensation he had felt before. This was something new. A radiant light enveloped him, illuminating his surroundings with an ethereal glow. He could feel it, a surge of energy coursing through his veins, reaching every corner of his body. For the first time, he could sense the flow of star elements within him. The energy pulsed rhythmically, resonating with the very essence of his being. The once foreign concept had now become tangible. His heart pounded with excitement as he realized what had just happened. This was it, the awakening of his connection to the star elements. Though the experience had been harsh, it had served its purpose. Kuroboshi's determination and resilience had allowed him to endure the pain, and in doing so, he had unlocked the first step toward mastering his abilities.